Hello and welcome to Books and Landscape, and my name is Amanda Davey, and this is another in the series looking at the patterns that have come up as a result of working on the churches of the South Downs National Park. And this one today is the first of three on rampaging across the South Downs near the churches or related to the churches. And it deals with war. We think of the South Downs as a sort of peaceful place with skylarks twittering above us and wonderful open air experiences, but it's a landscape that has been through a lot of change, and war on the south coast has been quite a factor. So this is the first one deals with from the Romans through to just before the Civil War. The second one will deal with the Civil War, and the third one will deal with probably just before, just after the Civil War through to World War One and World War Two. So there's a lot to cover, and there's a lot in it. So to begin with, the Romans turn up, go away, come back again, and then go away again. Julius Caesar's forays, I'm going to have to look at the screen a lot because there's so much. Julius Caesar's forays were in 55 to 54 BC, leading to various alliances, but not much more apart from Veni Vidi Vici, depending on who taught you Latin, if they taught you Latin, and that wasn't even about Britain apparently, according to Wikipedia. So, I came, I saw, I conquered. Then Claudius's troops began with more determination in AD 43, starting in Kent and moving west into Sussex and Hampshire, from where the network of roads for which they are so famous was begun, to help speed the movement of troops through their new territories. In Bramber, the Romans used the high ground, with Julius Caesar's governor approving of the strategic position. And then William de Braose was the instigator of the castle and church in 1073, shortly after the Norman Conquest. There was a Roman Manzio north of Coldwaltham as a staging post that was west of Harden. Milland Evangelical Church has a Roman Manzio just to the south, only located from a 1949 air photograph by the Ordnance Surveyors. It is in a distant corner of West Sussex, so this and the associated Roman road from Chichester to Silchester took a while to turn up, in spite of having had influence on parish boundaries, etc. Then we come to the Viking and Danish raids mingling with Anglo-Saxon and Britons. After the Romans finally left in the 5th century, there was a spate of warlike years preceding the Norman Conquest. Church building happened in the quiet spells, or appears to have happened in the quiet spells in the main, before the Danish incursions of the 980s. Then by Canute's reign it was more peaceful. Viking raids and the alternating nationality of kings led to more stone structures rather than wood. The previous ones were wood. There were also Viking raids in Normandy, so it wasn't just here. Additionally, thanes and knights were building churches, looking for protection from God for their families. The Vikings tried and failed to take Chichester in 895 before the Norman removal of the cathedra from Selsey to Chichester in 1075. In 1066 came the Norman Conquest, but it wasn't completed apparently until 1071. In 1066, William the Conqueror had a problem with Harold interfering with Stenning and its relationship with the Norman Abbey of Fécamp. He used this as an excuse to refer to his conquest as a holy war. Midhurst had a chapel inside the Motte and Bailey on St Anne's Hill, built in 1120. Edberton, a scheduled ring ditch and mound quietly called Edberton Castle, may have been built just after the Conquest as a Motte and Bailey. Arundel and Berpham. Until the Conquest, Berpham had been the more important settlement. Roger de Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, preferred the higher ground of Arundel to that of Alfred's borough overlooking the River Arun at Berpham, still strategic but less imposing. The church tower at Berpham is 15th century. Is this a strategic position indication, given that the date is within the Wars of the Roses and the crenellations may relate to that? St Cross was founded by King Stephen's youngest brother, and then Winchester was caught up in the battle with Matilda, so there was the Anarchy of Stephen and Matilda between 1139 to 49, and that was another uncomfortable period. And then a further uncomfortable period came with the Barons' Wars from 1215 to 17, and then another lot from 1264 to 1267. This is a complicated period in history, with rampaging wars at home and abroad. The 13th century began with the troubled reign of John, leading to the series of legislative measures known today as the Magna Carta, a copy of which is with the foundation documents for Easebourne Priory in the National Government for Australia in Canberra, a brief reign of Louis, the Lion of France, followed by the tumult of Henry III, John's son, and the Battle of Lewes that arose partly out of a family row but caused mayhem across Lewes. In 1217, there was a little remembered French invasion by Prince Louis in the weak years of the baby king Henry III. Louis captured Winchester in 1216 following John's death, and this also included an early battle at Lewes. In a feudal society, unhappy barons meant unhappy serfs, since they were required to pay more in dues as well as muster to their lord. It led to a revision of the first form of the Magna Carta. Then, in 1225, the now definitive version was another revision to allow for war with France, followed in 1297 with Edward I's need to raise money. But that is not the definitive version. St Michael and Railings of Lewes was affected by the rampaging around the castle during the 1264 Battle of Lewes, the 1264 one. The church is just below the castle walls. In 1381, in the Peasants' Revolt, the ringleaders that attacked the castle apparently included the rector. The French raids had been recent and the poll taxes cruel. Nearly 20 clergy were involved across the southeast. St Anne in Lewes, 1264 and the Battle of Lewes, and Simon de Montfort and the barons. In 1267 the town walls were constructed with the extramural settlement that led up to the church. I love the use of extramural to mean outside the wall, rather than just sort of not a full degree sort of thing at universities. Opham. In 1264, the barons and Simon de Montfort climbed the hill, the scarp, above the village with the successful intention of intimidating those watching from Lewes Castle. Henry III lost. He went to the priory where he and Edward, his son, later Edward I, were captured. Then came Edward I, who took a good number of church patrons off to war with him in France and Scotland, which brought them rich pickings and contributed to building work when they returned home. Aymer de Valence at Newton Valence was a cousin of Edward's and an almost uncle to Edward II, which led to him helping against Scotland and Robert the Bruce and fighting at Bannockburn in 1314, when Robert the Bruce won, having watched a spider, made a web. The church at Trotton is early 14th century on an earlier site built by Sir Ralph de Camoy, or Sir Ralph, not quite sure which it would be, probably Ralph, the first Baron Camoys, who was captured at the Battle of Bannockburn again as part of the Scottish Wars of Edward I and II. The second first Baron Camoys, grandson through the female line of the first, fought at the Battle of Agincourt and was married to the widow of Henry Percy, Shakespeare's Hotspur, who had been based in Northumberland. The Petworth era for the Percys came later. Camoys had the still active but narrow bridge built, the one with the traffic lights on it that you stop at and forget to look at the church, which is next door. Edward II was a shocker who triggered all sorts of rampaging and involved more local knights. Then his son Edward III got obsessed with Calais. Richard II and Henry IV were grandsons of Edward III and engaged in further rampages. French raids on the coast involved local monks as well as serfs and caused damage to churches, although how many is not clear. Henry V got obsessed with France and dragged soldiers over there. This was the 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1453, and in amongst all that came the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Ovingdean has damage from a large fire that is believed to relate to French landings in 1377 on the death of Edward III. The prior of Lewes Priory was involved in trying to beat them back. The clergy were required to participate in fighting to avoid losing their lands, a bit more intense than Brother Cadfael. Hamsey feels like a strategic position next to the River Ouse, north of Lewes. The tower is 15th century with battlements and peepholes. The lords of the manor had a history of getting involved with problems of their time, including helping the Prior of Lewes against the marauding French in 1377. They also supported the Yorks in their battles with Henry VI in the Wars of the Roses. The manor house was still visible as remains next to the church in 1780, but is, of course, now no longer possible to see and has been ploughed out. In Amberley, the castle was built next to the church as a castle around 1380. A previous manor house had been built for the Bishop of Chichester in about 1150 to 60. This was following the 1380 build, was following a licence to crenellate in 1377, the year of the marauding French. These were Richard II's years, and the Peasants' Revolt was 1381. The threats were there of more French invasions as part of the 100 Years' War with France. It was rebuilt in the 15th century, which is interesting given the uncertainty of that century and the Wars of the Roses. Poynings, the church was rebuilt in the mid to late 14th century with money left by Michael of Poynings, whose family had fought for Edward III at the Battle of Cressy. The south transept was his and his family's tombs. The 100 Years' War with France led to the suppression of alien priories by Henry V in 1414 to 5, including Wilmington and Glynde. The Wars of the Roses then kick in from 1455 to 1485. Even more rampaging, although major battles did tend to be further north. At Washington, the crenellations on the tower might link to the end of the Wars of the Roses. At Cliff, the tower is late 15th century and did once have battlements, lost in the early 19th century repairs. Funtington has a crenellated 15th century tower. Then we come to Henry VIII and his temperament. From 1443 to 51, he was engaged in building of defences across the south coast. Ringmer, in 1743, a bit later, Cannons were blamed for tearing up the roads. Presumably they were intended to supply George II's last foray onto the continent, causing extremely deep ruts and culminating in the construction of the new road, the Broyle. Previously, the Reverend William Lovell, vicar from 1533, born into a family of ironmakers, had inherited the business, his family business. In 1543, he produced the first muzzle-loader cannons in England and orders soared, much to the delight of Henry VIII with his defences projects. Then Elizabeth I had many battles to stay on the throne. She was there from 1558 to 1603. In Titchbourne, one family member was tried with the Babington plot against Elizabeth and lost his life. But somehow, by sucking up to James when he came to the throne, the rest of them managed to keep their lands, and they also kept a Catholic chapel inside the church, so the sucking up was pretty full on. In Willingdon there's a Butts Lane, which implies some archery training, possibly for war preparation at some point, date not confirmed. Anyway, that's a snapshot of some of the impacts that have been evident in the work that I did on the church's book. Obviously there will have been a lot more going on, but there's still a lot that did go on that is possible to understand. They were not the times, were they the times we recognise? Maybe we're starting to recognise that times can be difficult. Let's hope we don't have the same levels of difficulty, please. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. It would be lovely if you could like, if you could subscribe, if you could comment, and wishing you all the very best. Thank you.